Hi everyone, it's Rohit. Today I'm going to be leading a lecture on impacting in Congress. This lecture is going to cover everything from the basics to some of the more advanced concepts in regards to impacting, and you can watch it if you're a beginner, an intermediate level debater, or if you're an advanced level debater that's just trying to get some of the nitty gritty down. Okay, let's jump right into it. Impacting. We're going to start off with the very basics. What are impacts? Impacts are essentially the ultimate effect of an argument. They're why we should care about the argument that you are making. We normally present them as the final portion of the argument after we've gotten through all of the evidence and the logic as to establish the warrants and the links behind the argument and proving it correct. And they're often alluded to in the claim of the argument. So, for example, if I presented an argument that was like, pass this legislation to help impoverished individuals would be considered the impact of my argument. That is the ultimate change that results because of it, and that is what we are going to see materialize in the world. It's why we should care about the argument beyond the debate space. Now, there are two main types of impacts we see in congressional debate. We see qualitative impacts and we see quantitative impacts. We'll start off with qualitative ones. These focus on changes in the quality or the nature of something. They're usually changes that cannot be measured. For example, if on a piece of legislation, I in the affirmation and am arguing that passing reduces racism, there is no actual way for me to quantify how much racism is reduced or how to measure less racism. But that's still an impact that exists. That doesn't mean that the impact isn't true, the fact that I can't measure it. It just means that it's something that happens but cannot be put into numerical terms. And this is what we refer to as a qualitative impact. The strength of these impacts often directly depends on how well you can explain them. There's no numbers for you to fall back on. So for me to explain less racism as an impact, or for less racism to be weighed well as an impact, I have to explain what less racism looks like. I have to explain why it matters. And I have to explain essentially how it's going to materialize in the event that no one can actually measure it with numerical amounts. How much racism is less racism? What changes in society? These are all what we refer to as qualitative reasoning skills. These are things that we do with qualitative impacts in order to get across to judges. This is the change that's happening, even if you cannot measure it. And the entire strength of this is dependent on how well I can get that explanation across. The other type of impact we'd see is our quantitative impacts. Quantitative impacts focus on numerical changes that can be measured. For example, if on an argument my impact was that there will be a 5% drop in America's GDP, this is a quantitative impact. You can measure it with numbers. I'm giving you the hard number of a 5% drop. I have written here that these impacts often need to be quantified. And I understand that might sound confusing, so let me explain that. What this means is that a lot of times we have impacts that can be numerically substantiated, but we don't do so. For example, we have impacts that are like, passing this legislation is going to kill jobs in the United States. This is something that we actually could quantify. We're just neglecting to do it. I could say, this is how many jobs are going to be lost. This is where the jobs are going to be lost and in what amounts the jobs are going to be lost. I could give you more numbers to explain this. I could give you more numbers to explain how wages will change, so on and so forth. But a lot of times we neglect to do this. And it's important to remember that whenever you're presenting a quantitative impact, you neglecting to present that quantity is actually going to severely decrease the strength that the impact has. So anytime you have an impact that can be substantiated with numbers, you want to make sure you try to do that. If I'm going to impact out to less jobs in the United States, I want to make sure that I try to find at least some figure that explains how many less jobs. And in the event that I can't, it's fine, I'll have to roll with it. But in the event that I can, I want to make sure that I include that, because if I include that, it strengthens the argument quite a bit and it makes the impact a lot better. So, talking about that strengthening, the strength of quantitative impacts often directly depends on the quality of the evidence that you present and the numbers that you present in the first place. So, quality of evidence is pretty simple. If I present numbers from Fox News and someone else presents numbers from the National Bureau of Economic Research, it's pretty obvious whose numbers we're going to prefer, the ones from the more credible source. So, the ones from the National Bureau of Economic Research. In the same way, if we both are presenting numbers from credible sources, then obviously the weighing falls directly down into quantitative analysis in the first place. That is, which one has bigger numbers, which numbers matter more, right? So if I say that there's going to be a 5% drop in GDP, but then someone on the negation says that this piece of if someone on the affirmation says this piece of legislation will cause a 10% increase in GDP, then basic quantitative analysis means that there's actually going to be a 5% net gain. So you can compare the numbers on these types of impacts and see that numerically, some will come out on top of others. So these are the two big types of impact we deal with: qualitative impacts and quantitative impacts. Let's move on. What is the basic process of coming up with impacts? How do we come up with them? This is actually a lot simpler than most debaters think. The only real step here is just establishing the effects that the legislation will have on the world. All this means is that if I read a piece of legislation and I think, this is how the world will change when you pass the legislation, I have come up with the impacts. Don't overthink this part. This is where a lot of debaters mess up and start thinking, I have to think more steps down. I have to continue thinking about beyond these basic effects and think about more and more broad effects. No, start off with the simple stuff. Read the piece of legislation and think, how is it going to change the world? Once you've come up with a few ways it will change the world, those are the impacts you have come up with. And then we move on to the second step. This is the harder part. What impacts are you going to prioritize? Now that I've come up with a few different ways this legislation will change the world, what ones do I want to zero in on? Which ones do I think are the most important? Which ones are the most likely? These are all important questions to ask, and this is what we're going to get into next. What makes for a strong impact? When I'm in this process of prioritizing these impacts over those ones, which ones are the strongest ones, and how do I know I should choose these ones and try to focus on those other ones less? Okay, what makes for a strong impact? This is going to be a list of multiple measures that you can use to compare your impacts and decide which ones are the strongest. The first one, strong logic behind them. All strong impacts need to be warranted very well. That is to say, if I don't get the logic behind your argument, if I don't understand that it's actually true, then it doesn't matter what impact you come out with, because I'm not going to buy that the impact will come to fruition in the first place. I'm not going to buy that it'll ever happen. This is what we refer to as the likelihood of an impact. How probable is it that this scenario will come true? For example, we see a lot of times in other debate events, people impacting out to nuclear war as the terminal impact in the round. This is never really a good impact in Congress because nuclear war is highly unlikely. Chances are it's not going to happen. So even if you come up with some logical chain, the chain isn't very much believable. And that means that the impact isn't going to be very strong when we're weighing it down the bench. And by the way, to explain some of the terminology here, weighing is the way that we compare impacts. So weighing impacts against each other are comparing them and trying to come up with which ones are the stronger ones. Okay, second thing that we can think about, what is the impact's importance? Now you can normally just go with your gut on thinking about whether something is important or frivolous. And you can normally just compare them in your head about which one is more important than the other. This is what we refer to as the magnitude of an impact. The larger the magnitude, aka the more important it is, the stronger the impact will be. Now, like this slide says, most impacts you go for will probably have some degree of importance. So this normally comes into play when you're comparing different ones. For example, let's say I find that a piece of legislation is going to waste tax money, right? But on the other side, I see that this piece of legislation is going to save lives. It's pretty obvious which impact is going to be more important because saving lives are always going to be infinitely more valuable than saving tax money or making sure that tax money isn't wasted. So that's what we refer to as comparing the impact's magnitude. This is something to keep in mind when you're comparing different impacts and trying to decide which ones you prioritize. What is the magnitude of the impact? How important is it? Next question. How relevant is it to this specific debate that we are having today? Is affirming or negating this piece of legislation going to be the reason why the impact does or doesn't happen? Because if the impact happens either way, then it doesn't matter that much because there's no way to stop it, and voting affirmation or negation isn't going to change it. This is what we refer to as the uniqueness of an impact. How unique is it to this specific debate? How much does it matter to the decision that we make today when we either affirm or negate the legislation? To provide an example of this, wasting legislative time is a common impact that people run. A lot of times people say you should negate this legislation because it's ineffective, and the impact is that we waste legislative time. Now, that being said, that is an impact. It exists. We are wasting legislative time if the legislation is ineffective. But here's the problem. The impact is generally pretty weak because it's very non-unique. Legislative time is always wasted. Not a day goes by where Congress meets and they don't waste at least some time. So wasting it this one time doesn't matter that much because affirming or negating the legislation is not going to be the reason why legislative time is wasted or is not wasted. It will happen either way, and the extra time that you waste is probably not that relevant in the grand scheme of things. So this is why this impact is never really that strong. We want to think about the uniqueness of our impacts. We want to think about how important it is to this decision. How much does it hinge on this ballot? Because the stronger it hinges on that ballot, the more you can leverage that impact. For example, if this piece of legislation is going to be the deciding factor between whether lives get saved or lives are lost, I can hinge it on this legislation and I get more leverage to say that the affirmation or negation ballot is that much more important because saving or losing lives is directly decided by this vote. That's exactly why we focus on the uniqueness. It determines how important it is to this debate and to your side. Okay. What else can we consider? We can consider how many people the impact affects. In Congress, we are tasked with representing our constituents. So it's really important to consider how many of those constituents are actually going to be affected by the impact that we bring up. This is what we refer to as the scope of the impact. How wide-ranging is it? For example, let's say my impact is that this piece of legislation is going to increase taxes on Americans, right? But let's say it only increases taxes on those in the top 0.0000001%. This is probably not that many people. So the impact is probably not that strong because I have tons of other constituents I have to represent that are probably going to benefit from us increasing taxes and are going to be able to see some necessary improvements inside American democracy and inside society for them. So for those people who are a much larger group, it matters a lot more. This is what we refer to as comparing impacts on scope. Essentially, which group is bigger? Because the bigger the group, the more we should care about it, considering that there's more people that are either going to be succeeding or that are going to be losing out because of this decision. That being said, we not only have to consider how many people, we also have to consider the type of people. We can think about whether this group has been historically oppressed. We can think about whether this group is in significant need. And we can think about other issues like that. This is referred to as stakeholder analysis, looking at the stakeholders in the debate. For example, on this same impact about increasing tax burdens on the top 0.0001%, right? Increasing tax burdens isn't a very strong impact for Jeff Bezos because we all know that Jeff Bezos can handle paying a little bit extra in taxes. We all know it's not going to be life or death for him, and it's not going to be a matter of putting food on the table if we increase his taxes a little bit. That being said, if we were to run that same impact about increasing taxes, but it affects those inside the bottom 5%, that could be a matter of putting food on the table. It could be a matter of having shelter or not having shelter. And for those reasons, that same impact is a lot more important when it applies to a different group. This is the important stakeholder analysis that comes in when we're comparing impacts. We have to consider, who are we affecting with this? And it's not always just about comparing the same impact happening to different groups. It's also just about comparing who needs help more, right? Let's say that a piece of legislation is going to hurt one group that is already succeeding and one group that is like already at the top of society and like probably won't be hurt that bad. But it's going to help a group that's at the bottom of society, socioeconomically doesn't have much power, politically doesn't have much influence, and desperately needs help. It helps people that are in poverty and people that are homeless. That stakeholder analysis tells me that we should prefer this impact and we should still pass the legislation because the group that's at the top probably doesn't need our help that much and can probably take a little bit of a downfall if it means that this other group that's at the bottom gets a huge benefit because they're the group that needs us most. Think about this stakeholder analysis when you're choosing what impacts to go for, because you don't want to go for an impact that sounds super strong, but then ends up affecting a group that doesn't actually need it. Okay, Moving on, we can also consider special context in the world. Are there certain issues going on that make this impact more important? Is it imperative that this impact happens or doesn't happen right now? Will pushing it off 10 years become a bigger problem? Or will pushing it off 10 years make other issues pop up that exist already in the status quo? This is what we refer to as considering the impact's time frame or considering the context behind the impact. To give you an example of this, right now, obviously, the United States and the rest of the globe are going through a global pandemic with the COVID crisis. So when I'm debating at nationals next week, or when I'm going through and just go in a round over the summer or any time like that, and the impact about supporting healthcare systems is going to be much more important because we are in a global pandemic. So supporting healthcare systems is of the utmost importance to making sure that people don't die and to making sure that we can get through this pandemic quickly and safely. Thus, these impacts, because of the context behind them, are all the more important. The same thing goes for time frame, right? Let's say that let's say that someone on the negation is like, okay, yeah, giving hospitals more funding is important, but we can wait 10 years for that. I can clarify that the time frame of this impact is what makes it important. In 10 years, the COVID pandemic will have taken its toll on society. So we need to focus on supporting healthcare systems right now, because right now is when we can actually stop the casualties. In 10 years, it's going to be way too late. This is, again, bringing in that time frame analysis. What can we think of that makes this situation right now in history of the utmost importance for this impact? What makes it more significant, and what makes this impact more relevant to the debate by it being right now and by it not being 10 years ago or 10 years in the future? Finally, I think it's important to mention that any other factor that you think of can make an impact strong or weak. Anything that you think of that in terms of evaluating two different impacts and comparing them can be the reason why one impact is better than the others. I'm just giving you a few of what are called weighing mechanisms to break down the terminology here. These mechanisms are essentially criteria or different frameworks by which we can compare arguments and by which we can decide which impact is better. But there's infinite numbers of mechanisms in the world, and if you can come up with one in your head to compare two different impacts, chances are it's a pretty valid one. So try to stretch your mind and think about, when you're trying to decide what impacts do I prioritize, what impacts are better than other impacts, whether or not, or how to prove to a judge that your impacts are better than the other side's ones. Then you can think about these other factors and try to broaden your horizons and essentially come up with other ways that you could compare these. Again, these are some examples. These are the ones that are commonly referred to in the debate world, and these are the ones that will probably stand out to you the most. But there's a bunch of different ways to do it, and you don't always need the terminology. You just need to be able to explain why this impact is better than the other one. Try to get into that mindset of comparing them all the time. It's very good for the future of you being able to debate. Okay, now we are going to get on to the next portion. You have come up with the impact. You have prioritized which impact you want to focus on. You have decided, okay, I think this speech is going to be most powerful if I focus on these specific issues. Now, how do you frame them? How do you get those impacts across in the most persuasive manner, in a manner that makes judges want to vote off of that argument and want to vote you up as a speaker? One really good tip for framing impacts that gets forgotten a lot in the debate world is using evidence for them. Whenever possible, you can substantiate your impact with extra evidence. Your evidence section does not need to be limited to just proving the logic and the warrants behind your argument. You can give me extra evidence in the impact section. For example, instead of just saying less welfare benefits means that people can't buy food for a piece of legislation that would decrease welfare, you can read me evidence that says this many people rely on welfare benefits for basic necessities like food. This strengthens the impact quite a bit because, like we were talking about earlier when we were referring to the qualitative and quantitative impacts, I now have an actual number that I can write down and that I can believe you on. I can weigh this number. I can say, wow, he's not just saying that, oh, some people are going to lose food, but he's actually telling me that millions of people will be tossed into food insecurity if we cut welfare benefits. Thus, that impact becomes a lot stronger and a lot better in both the judges' minds and the rest of the debaters' minds. But it doesn't just stop there. It's not just a matter of proving your impact. You can also use evidence to expand on the impact in the first place, right? So obviously food insecurity is a bad thing, right? But If I can expand on that and explain why it's such a bad thing, I can prove to you that it's an even worse thing than you initially thought, then I make the impact all the stronger. For example, I could read you a piece of evidence that says a lack of food will harm educational outcomes. I could read you evidence that says a lack of food compromises health. Or I could read you any other evidence that says a lack of food has this negative detriment on society and on individuals. That means that when you present that evidence, the judge isn't just going off of their preconceived notions about how bad lack of food is. You're actually telling them, you're expanding on them, and you're completing the link in terms of telling them, this is why you care about my impact. This is the ultimate effect that society will experience. And this is the functional problem in this debate of you not voting for this argument, of you ignoring this impact. This is how it's going to materialize in people's day-to-day lives. Using that evidence for that substantiation is extremely important because it makes it so that judges don't just buy your impact off of what you say at face value and thus don't give it that much credibility, but instead they actually have hard evidence that they can look towards and say, wow, this speaker really gave me a good understanding of why I need to vote for them and how it's going to affect the world if I do not vote for them or if I do vote for them. That being said, what are some other presentation things that we can do to make sure that our impacts are expressed in the strongest manner? One big thing we can do, humanize the impacts. Explain to the judge and the rest of the chamber how these impacts actually affect people and affect their daily lives. Don't just say there's going to be a 1% drop in GDP if you pass this legislation. Go further. Tell me what a 1% drop in GDP does for people. Does it put more people into poverty? Does it decrease people's wages? Does it result in people getting laid off? Or so on and so forth. Give me examples of how this affects people's actual lives, because then you are painting a picture for me in terms of understanding why this argument is going to affect someone that I know, or why this argument is going to affect another human being that I care about, instead of just saying this argument is about numbers and numbers are important. Go that next step and bring some of that pathos appeal in. And that's exactly what this next tip is about. Pair impacts with strong rhetoric. So for beginners, you can try to interchange content-heavy sentences that are actually explaining the impact with other rhetoric that is going to be more persuasive and that's going to get the judge thinking about that picture in their head, right? So I can say this legislation will cause a 1% drop in GDP and then provide some rhetoric about how that puts more people into poverty and how like the struggle of poverty and how essentially people struggling while they're in poverty is like an extremely hard circumstance and is something that we need to target urgently. That being said, if you're a more advanced debater, you don't have to stick with the formula of just always interchanging things. You can try to actually blend them in the first place. So try to explain that content-heavy analysis using powerful rhetoric itself. Don't just say this legislation causes a 1% drop in GDP and then explain the rhetoric after that. Say a 1% drop in GDP might be only 1% or it might be a small number for us, but for thousands of Americans across the world, that means no food on the table or something along those lines where you're actually blending the impact itself with the rhetoric, making the section really cohesive and painting this picture in the judge's mind that you're not just a debater that has researched and that has found good evidence, but you're a debater that understands the impacts this has on day-to-day people, and that is going to make me as a judge care about what you are saying. That's the most important thing. The entire purpose of the impact section is getting the judge to weigh your argument in the long run and getting them to care about it. So we shouldn't try to skirt around or forget about some of the most basic ideas in terms of getting human beings to care about things, which is appealing to their emotions and presenting good pathos-heavy appeals. This is exactly what this rhetoric is doing. Okay, and that's just about everything I have for impacting. I think we went over how to come up with impacts. We went over how to decide between what impacts are better and how to compare impacts in rounds and in both the research process. And then we finally went over how we're going to present impacts once we've come up with them and how they fit into our speeches. If you have any other questions about impacting or about anything else about speech and debate, you can always ask the people on your team. You can ask your coach during coaching sessions, and you can ask us during weekly practice sessions, and we'll give you an answer that hopefully will answer your concerns. And if not, you can go ahead and ask us more questions, and we'll try our best to make sure that we explain the concept to you. Thank you all for watching this video. I hope you all have a great rest of the day. Bye now.